Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The sad and tragic case of Officer Jeffrey Jaeger of the Charlottesville Police Department is a story that really hasn't been told by the local media, and that's no surprise. I became familiar with the case about 6 months ago in the middle of it when the attorney made some comments to the local newspaper, and I contacted attorney Michael Hallahan to find out what was going on here and get a little more background. As I've dug through this, I've found out over and over and over again that the Charlottesville Police Department has apparently either violated its own policies or been dishonest with the public. Officer Jaeger's firing was broadcast on Friday by the Charlottesville Police Chief, Dr. Rochelle Brackney. She put it up on a virtual media event and commingled it with another issue that the Charlottesville Police Department was dealing with, and it caused a lot of ruckus in the media, particularly the first incident, not so much Officer Jaeger, but they were both grouped together. Now, this announcement that came last week followed a many months-long administrative leave for Officer Jaeger without receiving pay, and then this path to conviction in the courts, which was bizarre in and of itself. But you see what they did here. They cut the man off from his livelihood. They did not fire him. He wasn't able to do anything for months and months and months. I believe it was a fait accompli. Now, when the original incident happened, Officer Jaeger filed what they call a use of force report. Immediately after the incident, following all protocol, this report was reviewed by Lieutenant Tony Newberry at the Charlottesville Police Department by Corporal Chris Huber and also Captain Victor Mitchell. In this review, all of them found that the officer's actions were justified by the situation. There were no flags raised towards Officer Jeffrey Jaeger. There was some additional text written down in the report by Lieutenant Newberry, but none of them said there was anything wrong that was contrary to department policy. After this happened, then Lieutenant Newberry forwarded the review to Chief Brackney via an internal memo, and Chief Brackney of the Charlottesville Police Department did absolutely nothing with that information. In other words, by just not saying anything, she approved the report. Now, it was some time after that a retired local attorney got a bee in her bonnet and decided that she was going to contact the chief directly about this particular incident involving Officer Jaeger. So after Officer Jaeger was essentially cleared by the department, going through all the processes and checking and double checking his report and what happened on the scene, well, all of a sudden, an internal investigation was reopened. This is totally outrageous. And Officer Jaeger was charged with the crime by the Charlottesville Police Department, who was working in conjunction with the Charlottesville Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. See, I believe this was all planned. The police department and the Commonwealth's attorney, who's facing right now a contested race for re-election by somebody who's far to the left of him, want to make a statement to the community that we're looking out for people of color in this community, and there will be nothing tolerated that even contains a hint of impropriety. Well, there was no hint of impropriety according to the reviews that took place internally, and yet these two entities, the Charlottesville Police Department and the Charlottesville Commonwealth's Attorney, got together and dropped the hammer on Officer Jeffrey Jaeger. During the trial here in Charlottesville, Lieutenant Newberry, the one who had gone through this report after it was filed by Officer Jaeger, said that the actions were reasonable and preemptive given the setting. Now, I read the entire court transcript, so I know what was said there, but just to encapsulate all of this, he said, I took a look at what happened, and after seeing how it was escalating, the officer reacted quickly to remove the suspect from the heated area. And he also stated that if Officer Jaeger had not done that, there could have been a violent encounter between the suspect, who was restrained, and other individuals on the scene who were interacting with each other from a distance. Lieutenant Newberry also talked about what I call the situational nature of using force. In other words, a police officer is not a machine, and situations don't come out of a textbook. So this officer, Jeffrey Jaeger, had to use his own intuition, looking at the situation, make decisions very, very quickly, and then act on them. There's no time to wait in a situation like this because it can escalate and get out of hand very, very quickly. Attorney Hallahan asked Lieutenant Newberry, who was testifying in court, just to make sure that this report that was written up was given to the chief of police and that it was reviewed and that there were no policy violations found, and those were confirmed with yes answers. You know, it was a couple of years ago that I was invited to participate by the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund in a live fire simulation exercise where I had to pretend like I was a police officer. I was given a weapon, an electronic weapon, and put into an electronic scene and watch something going on, and I had mere seconds to decide how to react to what was happening. I failed every single one of the 3 or 4 scenarios I was in, and I failed them badly. It gave me a new appreciation for the things that police officers have to do, for the decisions that they have to make in a split second, and they have to be right every single time. In this instance, Officer Jaeger was found right in the internal report, and yet he was ultimately convicted by a so-called court of law here in Charlottesville. There appears to be absolutely no justice in this town. It doesn't depend on what you do, but it depends on who you are and I guess who the victim is. In this case, Mr. Jaeger, Officer Jaeger, was convicted and later fired, humiliated by the chief of police in Charlottesville, and now has a rough road ahead in rebuilding his life. This is an incident that never should have happened. The police chief should stand behind her own investigators when they investigate internally and not try to put on dog and pony shows for the public to show how woke she is. Officer Jaeger's court appeal will likely be heard in coming months, and I will keep you posted on his progress in getting back to his own life. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment.
Online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Charlottesville's community watchdog, Rob Schilling.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome to the program Stephen R. Soukup, the publisher of The Political Forum, author of the brand new book, The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, How Political Correctness Captured Big Business. And Steve, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
It's a very important book as we look around and see what's happening, although a lot of people are not really aware of what's behind it, which is where the book comes in. Can you help us understand woke capital?
Woke capital, anti-democratic movement being led by some of the biggest and most important names in American business to change the way American business works, to change the very definition of capitalism, and to alter permanently the relationship between the citizen and the state in this country.
Now, this goes back quite a ways, and you talk about how the left has been moving and trying to take over these institutions. Let's go back to perhaps the progressive era and talk a little bit about the players of the time. I'd like to go to Woodrow Wilson, and then maybe some who came out of Germany who were very influential in all of this.
I start the book in 1876 in Baltimore at the newly formed Johns Hopkins University, where a man named Richard Ely is a professor of political economy, and one of his students is Woodrow Wilson, a PhD student, also studying political economy. And Wilson and Ely are two of the godfathers of American progressivism. Wilson obviously goes on to become the president of Princeton University, the governor of New Jersey, and then the president of the United States, and advances some of the most far-reaching progressive policies in the history of the country. In addition, Wilson is also the godfather of American public administration, which is the idea largely expressed through his early work and then through the early formation of the American civil service, that society is simply too complicated in its modern form for the people to understand it properly and thus to govern themselves properly, meaning that they need to be guided by a professional class that is dedicated to providing professional, competent administration for the more complex issues that the people are unable to manage on their own. So this is where the anti-democratic nature of this entire business begins, with this idea that Americans simply cannot govern themselves and need to be guided by professionals who know better. And this is a theme that we see throughout American history from that point on. The progressive movement and then the post-progressives on the political left have long thought that there are experts that are better to take care of the important things in this country than the people are. And we see this playing out quite a bit today, even, in fact, when every single Democratic elected representative is asked about coronavirus, their response is always follow the science, follow the science. Hey, I follow the science. I listen to the experts. Understandable why they would say that, but this is clearly an indication that they believe that there are aspects to public life that the people are not equipped to manage and thus need to be guided by those who are smarter and better trained than they are. So that's one thread that runs throughout American history, and that it forms the foundation for this woke capital that we're seeing playing out today in American business. Another thread, as you mentioned, is the influence of some of the German philosophers. And this is the post-World War I, post-Marxist German philosophers who struggled, like many Marxists after the war, to come to grips with the fact that the revolution that they were promised never occurred. They couldn't quite understand what it was that prevented the workers from uniting and allowed nationalism to foment this great war that cost so much and took so much from Europe in the early part of the century. And what they decided, largely, was that the reason that the workers didn't unite and the reason that the workers didn't revolt was because they were trapped in this false consciousness, a false consciousness that was created by cultural hegemony on the part of a traditionalism that was based largely in Christianity. And so what they decided needed to be done was to undo this cultural influence and to allow, therefore, or thereby to allow the workers of the world to know their true selves and their true purpose, and thus to engage in the revolution. So what they began was what was later called the Long March Through the Institutions, an attempt to take over the institutions of the transmission of culture in the West, in order to undo this cultural influence, traditional cultural influence, and thus allow the revolution to take place. So over the course of the last 100 years, they've done so, and they've taken all of the cultural institutions from education to entertainment to media, and the last of these cultural institutions to remain standing was business, which, for obvious reasons, had a resistance to this aggressive leftism. Over the course of the past 20 years or so, though, we've seen this begin to falter as well. So you take these two streams of taking the institutions and introducing a new cultural tradition to these institutions, and you combine it with the anti-democratic nature of administration that runs through American history, and you combine these two, and you get essentially a powder keg, the foundation for what would become woke capital, what we are starting to see today in American business.
Steve, it's very interesting because in the book you talk about this hostility to Christianity, which you just referenced, but also that there was an overt attempt to sexualize children in some of these situations, which we see happening now in the United States of America. Talk about why those two things are very important.
As I said, the foundation for the traditional cultural milieu that these post-World War I Marxists saw as the defining cultural influence of the West were this Christianity was something that they believed was what was inhibiting man from understanding his true nature, and thus inhibiting the workers from understanding their true nature and their true interests in combining and creating this revolutionary fervor. And so they believed that a big part of the effort to undermine the traditional culture was to undermine the virtues and the values and the mores that dominated that moral structure. And one of those was obviously sex-related, and included all sorts of different ideas about how to undermine the traditional moral code with respect to sex. And we see this beginning in Hungary. As I mentioned, Lukács was a big player in this German movement to undermine the culture, and he had actually served in a brief role in the communist government in Hungary after World War I, in which he was a cultural minister, and he advocated for this destruction of traditional sexual mores. We see it again replayed in the 1950s with Herbert Marcuse's work on undermining traditional sexual beliefs and sexual mores, and his idea that in order to undermine the traditional culture, the traditional moral order, that we had to embrace sexual perversity and sexual deviancy, and that was one of the keys to destroying this Christian tradition that prevented man from understanding his true nature. And then we see this play out again in the late 1960s, into the 70s as well, with less formal theoretical background, but based on the same principles. This has been, again, a theme throughout Western civilization over at least the last century, if not longer, that in order to fully destroy the existing moral order, the moral order that prevents man from understanding his true nature and thus prevents the revolution from happening, that we need to undermine the sexual traditions, the sexual beliefs, and the sexual mores of the civilization, because that will truly destroy this existing order.
So how is it that the American public became susceptible to this as opposed to the wisdom and knowledge that we had when Tocqueville visited the country and beyond?
I think, in part, this was the natural evolution of the post-Enlightenment West. As Alistair McIntyre has pointed out, once you undermine the existing moral order, once you make it clear that that order is your target and you destroy that order, then you're left with a void that needs to be filled by a different moral structure, a different moral order. And the history of the West since the Enlightenment has been the attempt to create a new moral order repeatedly, and then the failures of these attempts over time. I think when Tocqueville visited in the 19th century, what we had were the remnants of the existing moral order, and certainly America's isolation geographically from Europe and from the source of a lot of these ideas helped a great deal in preserving the traditional order in this country for much longer than it continued in Europe. But eventually, over time, the ideas and the transmission of this new cultural revolution, I guess would be the word, eventually took its toll. And the beginning of this, I think, as I say in the book, is with the start of the progressive movement, with Richard Ely, with Woodrow Wilson, with the attempt to import the German style of education and the German style of understanding of man's nature and of man's history and role in the world. Eventually, of course, as this progressed and as the cultural Marxists took over the institutions of the West, and it became even more and more, it started to steamroll. It became more and more inevitable that this cultural decline would continue once education was fully taken by the cultural left, and it was only a matter of time before all the rest of the institutions would fall, because once you controlled the minds of the upcoming generations, then you essentially control the way in which they're going to manage those institutions. It was inevitable. It was beginning a slow decline throughout the 19th century, but over the course of the last 100 years or so, it's become a much more aggressive and a much quicker process.
Stephen Soukup is our guest. The book is The Dictatorship of Woke Capital. I want to talk about the ESG movement, environmental, social, and governance, and how this got entwined with the professional planners and the public administrators.
Yeah, well, ESG, as you say, stands for Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance. And it is an investment term, and it is probably the most, it's the hottest investment trend in the West, in Europe certainly, and the United States over the last 4 to 5 years. Literally hundreds of billions of dollars pouring into ESG investments over the course of that time span. And what the ESG movement attempts to do is to impose a certain environmental, social justice, and governance order upon publicly traded companies. For probably a quarter century before the ESG movement got rolling, there was a much more benign and much more democratic form of socially responsible investing that was common within financial services. And the way that worked is if you believed that certain companies produced products or engaged in behaviors that were contradictory to your values, then you simply screened those companies out of your profile, or out of your portfolio, pardon me. And this was a bipartisan and, as I said, very benign form of aligning one's values with one's investments. If you were willing to take a potential reduction in return on investment, then you were able to choose how you invested so that you could sleep at night, so that your values were reflected in your investments. Over the course of the last 10 years, though, ESG has become the dominant trend in social investing, and ESG is much more aggressive. Instead of simply trying to screen out companies that may contradict the values of the portfolio holder, what ESG tries to do is change the behavior of companies using shareholder proposals, using shareholder proxies, using shareholder voting rights. The ESG movement seeks to change the composition of corporate management, the composition of corporate directors, and corporate bylaws in order to push companies in a specific direction towards specific environmental, social, and governance goals. And so it's a very aggressive, very aggressive and very imposing trend employed by a lot of these large institutional investors, particularly passive asset managers, to advance their political goals using the money that they have accumulated from their investors. So it's a very different notion of socially responsible investing than that which we were used to in the financial services world prior to this.
You mentioned 3 specific companies with their own chapter in the back of the book: Apple, Disney, and Amazon. And I'd like to touch briefly on each one of those because I think it's important that people understand what's going on here. Particularly, let's start with Apple, their reliance on Foxconn and this connection with the Chinese Communist Party.
Apple is, without question, the ESG darling company in the United States. If you look at actively managed ESG portfolios, Apple is probably the most frequently owned company in those portfolios. It is a company that advocates for social justice. It is a company that professes to be extremely green friendly, and it is a company that insists that it is the best of American business and an example for other businesses as to how to function. The CEO, Tim Cook, does not allow a single social justice matter to go by without getting himself involved, either writing op-eds or donating shareholder money to address the issue. He is very aggressively social justice oriented in this country. If you take a trip across the Pacific Ocean, however, and examine Apple's behavior in China, a different picture begins to form, however. Over the course of the last 20 years, Tim Cook has been very aggressive about partnering with the Chinese Communist Party. Apple would not be where it is today without the CCP, and quite frankly, the CCP would not be where it is today, in the stable position it is today, without Apple. And yet, Apple's behavior in China is very contradictory to the image it wishes to profess in the United States. Social justice-wise, as you mentioned, the Foxconn plants that Apple uses to produce its products are really nightmarish by American standards. Dickensian, I think, might be the word. They're the standards of production and the standards of living for the workers who work there are atrocious. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. You know, there have been reports over the past couple of months showing that Apple's contractors in China have benefited from the slave labor of Uyghurs being held in captivity and being forced into doing various occupations by the central government in China. During the protests in Hong Kong over the last couple of years, the Chinese government asked for certain apps to be removed from the Apple App Store because the rebels were using them to organize, and Apple complied. So there's a series of social justice issues in the People's Republic of China where not only is Apple not protesting those the way they protest social justice in the United States, but they're actively complicit with the Chinese government. Additionally, Apple's green reputation takes a hit when you look at its operations in the People's Republic of China. The overwhelming majority of energy expended in the creation, manufacture, delivery, and sales of Apple products is used by Apple contractors. So when Apple says, we've reduced our emissions to zero, they're telling the truth about Apple Corporation. What they're doing is leaving out the part about all of their contractors, and these contractors based in Taiwan or in the PRC are using a considerable amount of energy and are using fossil fuels and are creating enormous emissions patterns. So Apple's reputation as both a social justice warrior and an extremely green company is something of a deception, to put it mildly.
We probably could go to Disney very quickly because there's a lot of hypocrisy there with Iger and the management of Disney. Particularly, you point out in the book, comparing and contrasting their concerns over America versus what's going on in the Shanghai resort or in France.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It is not coincidence that Apple and Disney are extremely similarly placed with respect to their behaviors in the United States versus their behaviors in the People's Republic of China. Apple and Disney are very much similar companies. Bob Iger sat on the board of directors for Apple for almost 10 years. For a long time, the largest single shareholder of Disney was Laurene Powell Jobs, Steve Jobs' widow. She's not the largest shareholder anymore, but she was for a long time. So these are two very interconnected companies, and they've had interconnected strategies. And among those strategies was the belief that the future for consumerism was in China. And the Disney Corporation not only bet its theme park future on, as you say, on this large Disney World theme park in Shanghai, but also bet much of its entertainment future on the People's Republic of China. And we see the effects of this and the effects of the Chinese Communist Party's influence on Disney in things like the Star Wars poster, in which John Boyega was removed or minimized because the Chinese government did not want an actor of color so prominently placed on a movie poster that would appear in China. Or in the Marvel films, Doctor Strange, where the Ancient One, who in the comic books is a Tibetan monk, becomes a middle-aged English woman in the movie because the Chinese government said you will not have a heroic Tibetan figure in a movie you wish to distribute in China. You see it in the credits of Mulan, where Disney Corporation is thanking the provincial government of Xinjiang province, which is where the Uyghurs are held in concentration camps. They thank the provincial government for their help and cooperation in making the film. So you see a great deal of capitulation to the Chinese Communist Party on the part of Disney, just as you see it on the part of Apple Corporation as well.
It all sounds very hopeless for the individual who's concerned over these things but doesn't have any way to act. So, Steve, what is it that individuals can be doing to push back?
Well, the most important thing for individuals to do is first to learn what is going on, to learn who is doing this and why they're doing it, to make themselves aware of what the issues are. And the second thing to do is, once you understand what the issues are, take back what is yours. Engage with these companies. Engage with your HR department that runs your 401k and decides on the funds that in which you are able to put your retirement savings. Engage with your investment advisor. Engage with companies that are doing things that you disapprove of. The instinct among most Americans is to boycott, to say, hey, Disney is doing X and I don't like X, therefore I'm not going to engage or to be involved with Disney at all. I think that's a mistake in this case. I think if we abandon the battle space to those who would weaponize capital for political ends, if we abandon that battle space, then we will concede it to them, and they will continue to dominate. And I think most of what we need to do is to reverse engineer what the other side has done, and to engage in our own right and demand that our squeaky wheel gets some grease as well. So what people should do is to try to understand the problem and then take back what is theirs. Take back their capital, either used in investments for retirement savings, or take back their dollars used as consumers, and engage with the companies that are doing things that we wish to change.
Stephen R. Soukup, if people want to get a copy of The Dictatorship of Woke Capital or be in touch with you, how can they do that?
They can get a copy of the book just about anywhere they'd like. Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, or EncounterBooks.com, which is the publisher. If they would like to get in touch with me, they can follow me on Twitter. I am at the Paul Forum on Twitter, or I can be reached via email at soukup@thepoliticalforum.com.
It's such an important book, and I'm so glad that you wrote it. Steve, thanks for joining us here today on The Schilling Show Unleashed.
Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
That concludes another edition of The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.